My name is Erica Melancon Fox. I am a singer, songwriter, and founder of an African American Heritage Museum in Lafayette, Maison Creole de Freetown. I grew up, our neighborhood didn't necessarily have a name per se, but just off of Willow Street and Evangeline Thruway, so North Side. Beautiful. I lived in a neighborhood that was very diverse as far as ethnicities and people that lived around me, various cultures, and music was very important to our entire neighborhood. If it wasn't, blasting in our house, you just had to go outside and you hear Cajun music at the corner and Zydeco at the other corner melting together. So I feel like our neighborhood was like a melting pot of different people and cultures coming together. It was really beautiful. There were a Cajun family just at the corner. As I mentioned, across the street from us was a Jewish family. And then next door on both sides, African American. So, and we played with each other. People back then actually knew their neighbors and went outside. And so you knew who everyone was on your street, the back street. So it was just a beautiful time. Creole for me, and it has a lot of descriptions, connotations, but for me, in my personal life, Creole meant connection to the land, to each other, and to our faith, our God. In our household, we always looked for direction to our grandparents. You didn't make a decision without going to Momo's house. So that connection to them was important. Every Sunday we went to both sides of our families for lunch and dinner. And that's where you got your wisdom, your motivation to keep going through the week, as well as it was just the place where you collaborated or met with other friends or family. So for me, Creole means like that kind of almost provincial country life. And like I mentioned, the connection to the land. You were always either going outside and grabbing some lettuce or tomato for that meal that you were going to have. If you were sick, you were picking leaves off the tree to make tea. It was very interactive. So Creole for me means a whole bunch of things. And then of course the language was important because everyone in our family spoke French, even the neighbors that would come by. They were speaking Kouri-Vani. And if you wanted to listen to grown folks talk, you had to work for it because you had to be able to kind of understand and decipher what they were saying. Both of my parents, grandparents, and their parents all spoke French. Like that was it. So if you wanted to talk to them, you had to know a little bit to be able to communicate with them. It was not uncommon to go and see them either watching Mass on television or praying the Rosary, Je vous salue Marie, pleine de grâce, le Seigneur est avec vous. And at the time, I did not know French, but you start to hear these words so much and memorize what they mean. It becomes infused in you whether you realize it or not. So when I did study French later on, it was like second nature because it was already exposed to me at a very, very early age. I also would like to say that their Christianity, faith was so important, especially intermingling the French and in their belief in Christ and God. Everything, even when they would pray, was like in French. The music they listened to was en français. So it was a very important part of their everyday lives. I keep going back to that word, the country, because a lot of them, like both sides of our family, were farmers and sharecroppers, and that was the language that they spoke in the field. So it was like a dialect of sorts that was almost like broken English mixed with French. It's definitely different from the Parisian French, if you will, that I learned in school, but there are a lot of similarities and ties between the two. I had family members like my grandfather who passed away when my dad was very young. He went and served in World War I and World War II, and his French is what helped him when he was overseas to communicate with some of the other people in Europe. So I would say it is different from Parisian French, but there are a lot of connections and ties between it. My culture means to me so many things, first of all, and to be able to just bottle it into one thing, I would revert back to like connection and creativity. They were very resourceful people. As I mentioned, faith and God was important to them because that was the sustaining factor. That was that connection between a higher source and then the connection amongst each other. It was a beautiful time. People made things with their hands. When we went to visit grandparents, we were not sitting watching TV or playing games. It was interactive. You had to go help put the clothes on the clothesline, or go feed the chickens in the yard, or go help Papa, make some chow chow from some of the vegetables in the yard. Like, you were having fun, but it was a different kind of fun. And I miss that. And I feel like we're kind of losing that connection, the tie to the land, the tie to one another. So I force my kids nowadays to embrace some of those Creole traditions, coming out and gardening, or just walking through the trees and having a respect for nature, and talking to people, calling people, showing up at people's houses, knocking on the door instead of texting when you're in the room next to us. So those types of things are important in the Creole tradition. I think the Creole connection to Louisiana or Lafayette specifically is vast, especially, and I'll go to a personal experience. My grandfather worked for Southern Pacific for the railroad for 33 years. So him working in a very public space, he interacted with a lot of other cultures. So like our family worked for some of the Lebanese community members, like the Tanneries and the Bustanis. My first job was working for Duke Tannery in the Four Corners. But I'm saying all that to say that our connection to other cultures in ways kind of blended that gumbo, or that I call it like a cultural utopia that we have here, because it was not uncommon for my mom, who worked as a help in one of their families, to not only show them about gumbo and etouffee, but we took some of their recipes and part of their culture and incorporated into ours. So I think those connections, again, made for very unique experiences. So it was nothing for us to like eat gumbo with some grape leaves, or kibbeh with our red beans and rice. So I think just those connections that we made created something very beautiful and very unique, that's only specific to this area. I would like to just see people make those connections again, to go back to that, to make an effort to go find out who your neighbors are, to talk to people that may not look like you, or sound like you, or eat the same things like you. I think we were a lot more adventurous back then to connect with one another, and we're kind of losing that. And I understand we live in a different time. But to just venture out and to go and experience life, and to appreciate people's perspectives that are different from yours. I love kibbeh, honestly. And I mean, that's not necessarily Creole, but my mom made it so well, and it was something that was a treat when she would make it. So that was probably one of my favorites when she would do it. Wow. So I'd like to preface that all of our neighborhoods are really important, and should be celebrated. Freetown is just especially special for me, because that's kind of where I would hear stories of my mom kind of hanging out. We had a lot of family that lived there. And one of the things about just the Lafayette neighborhoods in general, people were always crossing the tracks to like hang out with each other. So you maybe live in Macomb Visa area, but you worked in Freetown, or you might have liked to go and shop in Freetown area, but you lived in Truman. Like everybody was always connected. But Freetown seemed to be kind of like a meeting spot because there were businesses and churches, small entrepreneurs. So if you needed a hem, you could go get your, your clothes hemmed at a certain spot. If you wanted a hat, you can go to another place. So it was a thriving space, and it seemed like a beautiful community. Just listening to my family members talk about it. Freetown is especially important too because it's very close to the center of Lafayette, and so it was kind of an epicenter in a sense because it was the backside of the sugarcane plantation where Alexander Mouton had established his business. And so a lot of the people that were part of that industry lived in the Freetown area. It's also where my grandfather, who worked for the railroad, worked. He was illiterate, he couldn't read and write, but he lived a very beautiful life. We used to love to sit at his feet and listen to stories. He was our family griot, and having worked for the railroad, that same railroad that every time you hear the train pass by, I think of my grandfather because he helped build that. And then later in life, he was the driver for many of the managers or executives, if you will, for the railroad, and he traveled from coast to coast, from here to Texas to California, without even being able to read a sign. How did he do that? In a sense, he was like our Ernest Hemingway or Faulkner, because his stories were just so vivid and beautiful, to say that he came from very humble beginnings. And that's what, to me, Freetown represents. A lot of people just kind of pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. And it's just a beautiful, magical place. And it's one of the reasons why we've chosen to make that our center, because of all the beautiful stories and people that came out of there. It depends on what time period in our history that you mentioned the term Creole. It could even be people of non-mixed heritage, but I think language is a very important part of it, whether it's en français, French, or even Spanish or Native American, because there was so many different languages that also make up Creole. So yes, but I think the language is a very strong representation of the word. I would only say that it's really cool. We've had some walking tours with the kids, and they were so inspired to know that they didn't have to go outside of Lafayette to learn some pretty amazing stories about their city and the people around them. Um, they were excited to know about industry and businesses and just some of the things that happen in the community. It made it more real, and they realized they come from good stock.